Hello everybody and welcome to this video. This is going to be the first video that's going to be talking about the idea of the relationships between humans and nature. Before we get too far into the discussion though, I kind of want to talk about a couple of things that we've already essentially kind of covered when it comes to the idea of human and nature relationships. So first is this idea of humanity and its placement within that great chain of being. The fact that we view ourselves as usually more superior, more complex, and having more value than other things in nature, such as animals or plants. And we see this both in Abrahamic faiths, such as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, as well as we see it in kind of some of the transmigration or reincarnation beliefs of certain types of Buddhism. But this isn't just something that is relegated to religion. This is something we actually see in the use of scientific research when it comes to things such as, drug testing for various types of drugs for different types of diseases or disorders. We also have various animal models that use animals to help us understand different types of medical issues, such as using rats to understand stroke. And this is all because at a certain level, us as a society have determined that humans are worth more than animals, because what we're going to do is we're going to test things on animals before we actually test it on humans, encode that within our ethical principles. Now, of course, we can make the argument that they are treated well and very ethically up to the point that they're being used for various types of testing, and even during those moments of testing to a certain degree. However, we can't really deny that we're using animals first before humans because we value humans over these animals' lives. Because it's unethical in our system to test a drug on a human if you haven't tested it on an animal first. Another way we've kind of discussed this idea of human-nature relationships is the need for humanity to some extent to distance itself from its animal nature and its creatureliness, and we talked about this in the context of terror management theory, that the various types of things that remind us of our animal nature, such as, defecating, urinating, sex, aggression, so on and so on, all of these different things can serve as an existential threat and a reminder of our mortal nature. So one way to deny our death is to deny our nature, to deny nature itself. So in at least these 2 points, but it could be found in others, we've already talked about the idea of human and nature relationships. And this is actually, I think, one of the biggest challenges of this class. As much as I love teaching it, it is actually very hard to structure because there's so much overlap across these different ideas. So, talking about human nature relationships, definitely getting into TMT, the idea of human value. So we're going to kind of reiterate some of those points, but I'm going to try to expand on them quite a bit as well. But we also see this with the idea of human-pet relationships, what I want to talk a little bit more about when we talk about anthropomorphism. Or even when I talk about human-technology relationships, this similar thing is going to be happening where there's going to be things that I want to talk about in terms of anthropomorphism, so I might kind of leave that for that section instead. But this is also kind of a positive because I see this as kind of showing how interconnected these ideas either are or they can be. But with that, let's kind of continue this discussion on human-nature relationships. When studying the relationship between humanity and nature, we can do so in many different ways. We can talk about how humans relate to nature, either through protecting it or exploiting it. We can talk about the idea that, humans are part of nature, and therefore, our behaviors, tendencies, and even some of our attitudes are essentially these, expressions of our naturalistic tendencies or instincts. And this is something that, evolutionary psychology really focuses on. But what I want to do is I kind of want to focus on how we understand ideas such as nature and humanity and how that may actually affect the other construct. And we'll talk about a lot of different studies in this section. What we'll see is several factors, and it's going to include experience and culture, but other things such as personality or even motivation in terms of the motivation to deny the fact that we're going to die. Well, these factors are going to kind of shape how we understand nature, and this is going to influence our understanding of humanity and in turn our behavior. As well as these factors are going to help inform how we understand humanity, and that will influence our understanding of nature and in turn our behavior towards nature or against. So essentially, how we understand humanity and nature are going to kind of offer some sort of insight into how we may treat one or the other. But there's an important question here we need to address before we get a little bit further, and I think this might help clarify some issues that some people might have is, does anyone really notice a problem with the wording of these statements? Well, one of the problems is that it's separating this idea of humanity and nature, and it assumes that humans are not part of nature. Rather, it assumes that there's a separation between the two. And this is something that I think is kind of informed by various types of biases, and especially from a more kind of modern, quote unquote, technological a society that has often separated itself in very physical ways from what we understand as nature. So, for many people, nature is where you go when you go camping, or where people that live in the middle of nowhere live. Nature is something that is chaotic and devoid of humanity in some cases for, some people's perspectives. So no one really says that they're going to enjoy nature and then go outside in the middle of downtown Edmonton. No, what they're going to do is they're probably going to go to the river valley where there's relatively much fewer people. There's going to be, plants, bugs, various types of animals, or, maybe even Jasper or Banff and enjoy the mountains and nature in that sense, where there's less people, less, human involvement in the sense of, not as many buildings, streets, various types of human artifacts. And we tend to associate these places to be more natural or nature based, the less interaction that humans have had with it. So we do see this kind of distinction between humans and natures in a lot of the cultures today. And this distinction is going to inform how they're going to treat nature, treat animals, the environment, and all the such. But for some other cultures, this distinction between humanity and nature doesn't make any sense because humans are part of nature. They're just another form of it, just as the beetle, the sunflower, the sun, the mountains, all these things are for them essentially nature in the same way that humanity is. And that things that are unnatural, such as the buildings we make, are just another expression of what animals would do in a similar fashion, such as making their own habitats. So I'm kind of acknowledging my own cultural biases here by talking about human and nature relationships as if these are two different things, but this is largely a product of my cultural upbringing. And this largely, resides within an implicit understanding, because explicitly I understand that humanity is part of nature, but at an implicit or unconscious level, I do kind of distinguish the two in very strong ways. So basically, this is just a kind of acknowledgement of that, but also addressing people that have more of that unconscious implicit belief that humanity is a part of nature, so intertwined with nature, to at some sort of level for the purpose of this lecture to kind of separate the two, because it's going to be important to understand some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about. So what are some of the concepts I'm going to be talking about when I'm talking about human-nature relationships? Well, one is going to be a model for prejudice that explains our prejudices against outgroups in terms of how we view ourselves in relation to other animals. Then I'm going to get into the idea of how our understanding of the differences or similarities between humans and animals will influence animal rights. And then the last part I want to talk about is kind of basically what I was getting into, is that this idea of our understanding of humanity and nature and the relationship between the two are largely informed by our kind of folk biology. And by folk biology, I mean kind of these intuitions that we have about how biology and biological processes work. So that's going to be the kind of main setup for the human-nature relationships. But as I mentioned before, we've already talked about a couple different things that's very relevant for this conversation that I might allude to, as well as there's going to be things later on in the term that I'm going to be talking about that's going to definitely be part of this human-nature relationships. But for various reasons, I decided to place it in the context of another lecture. So hopefully this will kind of help you see some of the overlap of a lot of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about in the course. And if you were to just look at it, it might seem like it's disorganized and just kind of all over the place, but each of these tend to be kind of situated with some sort of intent. So with that, I'm going to end the video here, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about the interspecies models of prejudice, and how some of those researchers actually took some of those ideas and looked at this idea of how it can inform our understanding of animal rights. And on that note, I will leave you here, and I'll see you in the next video.